more evidence that perceiving is for doing, we can take a look at the social role of automaticity, in particular at non-conscious behavioral mimicry and at non-conscious norm conformity and at negative social associations. First up, let's get started with behavioral mimicry. Here we can consult a study where participants first interacted with two confederates. So that means people who were in on the study, kind of the helpers of the experimenters. So participants interacted with two confederates, one after the other. And then participants and confederates took turns describing what they saw in various photographs. Throughout the first parts, confederates either rubbed their noses or were shaking their foot. You can't see my foot, otherwise I would be shaking that for you now. Our dependent variable is whether participants would actually mimic that behavior. So whether or not they would be also rubbing their nose or shaking their foot. And here we have the data, so the number of times per minute on the y-axis that participants, and now for the blue bars, either also rubbed their face or also shook their foot, depending on whether the confederate rubbed their face, that's on the x-axis, the left two bars, or the confederate shook their foot, this is on the x-axis, the right two bars. So we have the frequency of face rubs of participants being higher when the confederate rubbed their face compared to when the confederate shook their foot, and the other way around, we have the participant's foot shaking higher, the number of times per minute that occurred when the confederate had shaken their foot compared to when the confederate had rubbed their nose, hopefully not shaken their nose. Okay, so what do we have here? We have behavioral mimicry. Participants mimicked the behavior of the confederate. Another experiment that goes in a similar direction is this, where the confederate, the second confederate, either mimicked the posture and mannerisms of the participant or they did not. And participants then reported in an exit questionnaire how much they liked the confederate and how smoothly they thought the interaction with the confederate went. Now, what do you expect? What do you expect if the confederate too was not mimicking the posture compared to mimicking the posture of the participants? Pause the video and think a moment what your expectation would be. Okay, let's take a look at whether your expectation comes through. So here we have the data on the exit questionnaire. So we have the reported liking on the left and the reported smoothness of the interaction on the right. And in blue, those are reports from participants where the confederate mimicked their behavior. And in red, we have data from participants where the confederate did not mimic their behavior. And what do we see? Participants liked the confederate better, who did the same stuff they were doing. And they also thought that the interaction with this person went more smoothly. But there's more. We can also take a look at non-conscious mimicry, behavioral mimicry, in the wild and less in the lab. So in this study, a waitress either mimicked her customers by literally repeating their order, so reading the order back to them, or did not mimic the customer. So in this case, she did not mimic their behavior. And the dependent variable in this study was how much did she get tipped? Again, what do you expect? Or rather, if you were a waiter, what do you think you should do? Should you mimic your customers or should you not, assuming that you want to get a bigger tip? Well, the data shows in this study that the tip was higher if the waitress had mimicked the order had read back the order of the customers, therefore mimicking their behavior, than if she had not done that. So what is the role of automaticity here? It's clearly, it takes a social role in this behavioral mimicry. So there seem to be some mechanisms involved in this perception-behavior link where just merely perceiving another's behavior automatically increases the likelihood of engaging in that behavior oneself. And this produces something like an empathetic understanding and liking and the feeling of smoothness in your interaction between the people where this mimicry happens. The social role of automaticity, however, is not limited to behavioral mimicry. Norm conformity also has something to do often with automatic behavior. And initially we spoke about whether criminal behavior, if we are really responsible for that, if our brains commit crimes or if we can be held responsible. But now this time I want to talk not necessarily about criminal behavior, but about behavior that is socially expected, socially desired, the right thing to do, the normatively expected thing to do. And I want to ask you to think about whether you can produce arguments for why we behave in a way that conforms with social norms, and to make arguments both from the direction of the intuitive, automatic way of thinking. So why would automaticity, how could automaticity create behavior that's norm-conform, but also from the effortful, controlled, deliberate decision-making kind of perspective. So why would we conform to norms if we really think about it? Pause the video and try to come up with arguments from both dual process perspectives for why we behave in socially expected ways. Now, if you're back, we can discuss this in more detail. So why would we behave in socially expected ways given a specific environment? Well, on the one hand, we might have something like acceptance needs. And we think, well, I want to be part of my social environment, therefore I should play along. There might also be reasons like reciprocity. If I do stuff as others expected, I can also expect others to do what I expect onto me. Yeah. So, and these would be arguments from the kind of conscious, deliberate perspective. So it makes sense. If you think about it, it makes sense to adapt to social expectations. But on the other hand, we also can make arguments from the pre-conscious, kind of intuitive, automatic perspectives. For instance, that if we activate a certain norm, this automatically leads to norm-consistent behavior. So this would be the idea that we prime people with a specific norm content, and therefore we get their system ready to act in ways that is consistent with this norm. So, and why would this be good? Because, well, automatic processing frees up some space for cognitive processing, for instance, for subsequent tasks, and therefore it's just perhaps an efficient way of dealing with complicated social interactions, right? So we're moving towards the idea that we can't only prime sort of simple behaviors, but actually more complex behaviors, such as behaviors that deal with norm conformity. And we can also consider a study where this idea that we can prime norm conformity was examined. In this study, participants were either shown a library picture and were told to, just check out the picture. There was actually no specific goal primed here. Participants in another condition were shown the same picture of a library, but were told to imagine they would visit this place. So there was a goal activated that had to do with the library and with what kind of behaviors would be expected of a person if they wanted to visit this place. In the third condition, participants were shown a picture of a railway station and were told to imagine they would visit this place. And here this is thought that we still have activated a goal, which is to go there and behave appropriately. But this was the control condition in this case because it didn't actually have anything to do with the dependent variable, which we will next take a look at. And that is, wrong slide, what we have here. So the dependent variable would be in a lexical decision task. Indicate as fast as you can if certain letters actually make up a word. So participants were shown words and scrambled letters, and we're supposed to indicate as quickly as possible if these letters were actually words. And they were shown silence words. That's why the library condition is actually involves our goal prime, because you're supposed to be quiet in the library, right? So silence words like silent, quiet, whisper, still, and control words like large, small, middle, begin, things that have nothing to do with silence. And there were also some non-words in this. And then, like I said, in this task, participants were supposed to decide if it was a word or not. And here is the data for the response latency. So how long it took participants to decide if a word / some letters were actually a word. And we can take a look at the response latencies here as a function of the goal prime and the type of word that they were shown before. So the type of words that we have in our lexical decision tasks are either silence words or control words, right? And now we can take a look at how fast people were in responding and actually recognizing that a word is a word. In the railway condition, that's kind of there is a goal active, but it's not relevant to silence. Railways aren't relevant to silence. So what we see here is actually no big difference in terms of the response latency between silence words and control words, right? No evidence that participants were faster in responding to silence words. Why would they be? In looking at the library picture, second column, this is the, just look at this picture condition. So there's no prime activated, no goal primed in terms of having to stay silent when going there, right? It was just looking at the library. And here we also see no evidence that the latencies were different between silence words and control words. But if we look at the third condition, where participants were shown the picture of the library and were told to think that, imagine what it would be like going there. So there was a goal activated, and this was actually relevant to our silence versus control words, right? What we see here is that participants were faster in responding to silence words than in responding to control words. And this would be evidence that indeed the norm of staying silent in the library was activated in that condition and only in that condition, not in the two other conditions. So the idea of a library itself doesn't make people be quiet in this experiment. Also, the idea of going somewhere in itself doesn't make people react more quickly to being quiet. But the combination thereof, so library plus the goal of going there, this activates the content that you're supposed to be quiet there, and therefore then participants are faster at reacting to silence words. Now, this is not necessarily behavior, right? Well, it is kind of behavior in the sense that participants had to respond and click a button and say this is a word or non-word. But I guess we can also get a better measure for participants' behavior as a reaction to these three conditions. And the authors of this study thought so too. So they also measured the volume of participants' voice during this experiment. And here we have the same three conditions. And we've split this data up between men and women because apparently men speak in general with a bit of a louder voice. So if we take a look at the railway and the library condition, we can see that these look pretty similar, but that the volume of participants' voice was slightly lower in the library plus goal condition. And again, this is difficult to tell apart in detail because there are no error bars. But in line with the expectations, this is what you would expect to see, that the volume of participants' voice would be more quiet in the library and goal condition. So we have evidence here that the idea of norm conformity can be primed and then can be translated into norm conform behavior. So the cool part about automaticity is that it frees up some of our mental capacity, frees up some processing power, and can help us behave in a socially adaptive way without having to wreck our brains about it. But is it always good that this is the case? Well, no, actually, it depends on individuals' mental associations. And to bring home that point that priming norms and priming behavior isn't always great, let's take a look at another experiment here where we are going to speak about negative social associations. And in this experiment, participants were told that they would participate in 2 experiments. First, one on reading speed, but actually, participants were primed here with words that dealt either with power or sex in a sequential priming task. And they were asked to pronounce words that either dealt with sex or power as fast as possible. And after that, power or sex words were flashed 90 milliseconds prior to displaying a target stimulus. And participants were also separated by their inclination to sexually harass. Apparently there's a questionnaire that you can use to determine how likely it is that someone will do this. And they were separated into low versus high likelihood. So kind of that's their trait likelihood to be a sexual harasser that they come into this experiment with. So what we have here is the results in terms of facilitation scores. And what does that mean on the y-axis, by the way? Basically, that's the increase or decrease in the speed of response times to target stimuli because of the presence of a prime versus no prime. So it's just a response time difference. And we have response time differences here for sex words after power prime and for power words after sex primes. And we have this split up for men who either score very high on the likelihood to sexually harass scale or men who score very low on this scale. And the men who are scoring very high, those are in the shaded bars. We can see here that they react differently to the different primes, right? They react differently to, they're sensitive to the priming with power primes or sex primes. But men who were in the lowest quartile of the likelihood to sexually harass scale, they actually, you can see there's barely any movement in the white bars between the conditions here. So meaning that not everyone is susceptible to the same types of primes. The kind of person that you are might change what what type of primes you're susceptible for. There's some more evidence in the same study or in the same paper about this idea where participants were asked to rate photos with female Confederates on them, and they did that after they were primed with words that either had to do with power or with nothing much, so control words. And for power words, there would be some examples here like boss or control, authority, influence. And then participants were separated again by a specific trait, this time high versus low score on the attractiveness of sexual aggression scale. And they were then rated the photos of the female Confederate. And if we take a look at the ratings here, we can see that the data for neutral primes, so this is the attractiveness rating on the y-axis, and for neutral primes, neutral words used before participants were asked to rate the picture of the Confederate, high versus low likelihood of attractiveness of sexual aggression led actually to differences in the attractiveness rating. So people who were low in the attractiveness of sexual aggression scale, they rated this Confederate to be much more attractive than participants who were low in the scale. So how can I see that? It's because people who are low on attractiveness of sexual aggression, their data is marked with the circles, and then the one where the endpoints are X's, that's for people who scored high on the scale. So for people who scored low, they in the neutral prime condition rated the female Confederate as far more attractive than the people in the who were who thought sexual aggression was highly attractive. But in the power prime, this brought up the rating of attractiveness only, though, for people who thought that sexual aggression was highly attractive. So these results would then support the idea that people who are likely to sexual aggress or who think it's very attractive to be aggressive sexually were more attracted to or found this Confederate more attractive if they had been primed with the thoughts of power. But for people who didn't find sexual aggression attractive, this prime didn't upregulate the attractiveness of the female confederate. So again, the point is that how effective a prime is in affecting behavior may depend on the kind of person that receives this prime.